Welcome to Philosophy with Xing, where we uncover the beauty behind philosophy. In today's episode, I have all the annotations here to answer the question, how far can the study of the past be scientific? So throughout the process of me explaining how we might approach this question, you can take a look at the different annotations that I've written down over here and follow along. So in firstly, dissecting the question, I have identified 4 key phrases. How, can, the past, and scientific. For the understanding of how, we have to ask ourselves whether or not this question is a question about the extent or whether the question is about yes, no, black and white answer. So what do I mean by yes, no, black and white answer? A yes, no, black and white answer could be something like, can the study of the past be scientific? So you can only say can or cannot. But if the question asks you, how far can the study of the past be scientific, we're asking about the extent to which the study of the past can be scientific, which also means that an implied assumption in the question is that the study of the past can be scientific. Because it's already a given that it can be scientific, so now we're asking how far can it be scientific. The second key word will be can. There's a difference between can and should. Can is whether or not something is able to be studied scientifically, whereas should is casting a value judgment and asking yourself whether or not the study of the past should be scientific, in the sense that while it can be scientific, is it good for it to be studied scientifically? So that's something that you need to make a distinction of. Of course, when you're answering this question, we can always first answer whether the study of the past can be scientific and how far it can be scientific before casting a value judgment to say, okay, although it can, should it be studied scientifically? Alright, and the third key phrase would be the past, which is of course defined as history, because history is the study of the past. And in thinking about this question, we always ask ourselves, what is the nature of history and what is the methods of construction of history? And well, some parts of history could be constructed through the scientific method, whereas others require more interpretivist methods, which you will find out later as I explain. The fourth key word is scientific. Once again, similar to dissecting the idea of history, this time we're dissecting the idea of science. And in analyzing what scientific as a keyword means in this question, we have to break it down into both its methods and its nature. So what's the nature of scientific knowledge? It's about the external, mind-independent reality, something that we can directly access, and we can understand more about science through observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and theorizing various scientific theories, which is somewhat linked to the scientific method, as we can cite Baconian scientific method. Alright, so when we're thinking about the nature and methods of scientific knowledge construction, we can begin to draw parallels with that of historical knowledge construction and ask ourselves whether or not we think that scientific methods can be transported to study the past and to study history. So let me move to the right side of the screen. And when I mentioned scientific methods just now, we can draw parallels to the logical positivist approach by Leopold von Ranke. And basically, what he as a philosopher suggests is that history can be studied methodically using a method that's similar to the scientific method by studying things empirically through perhaps looking at historical sources, archaeological sources, and dating these and doing like carbon dating or dating these historical artifacts back in time in order to create a historically accurate timeline of events. However, while these types of historical knowledge about what exactly happened, like the facts of the past, say which country conquered which country on what day, at what time, in what year, while this is indeed historical knowledge, some philosophers also argue that such knowledge is meaningless in the sense that what history should focus upon is interpretations. As you can see, historians make inferences through historical sources in order to form a better picture about how history was like in the past. So for example, if there was a prominent historical figure making a speech, historians would analyze the speech and they would make inferences about the personality or the character or even the leadership style of this prominent historical figure in order to better understand the circumstances of the past in which certain events could have happened, or some events were triggered, or maybe the past was shaped into what we can see today. Alright, and the second objection to why some philosophers think that the logical positivist approach doesn't really work is because the past is indirectly accessible, meaning that the past cannot be accessible directly as compared to the sciences. So in the sciences, when we want to do an experiment, we can simply mix the chemicals on the spot. However, for history, we are unable to travel back in time to access the past directly to see for ourselves what exactly happened. We also cannot make the historical figure act a different way because we cannot change the past, and time is unidirectional, and all these reasons make the past inaccessible. And that's why some people might think that using the scientific method or modeling history after the sciences gives us meaningless knowledge, because history as a area of knowledge itself does not strive to be like sciences because of their differing natures, and it shouldn't really strive to be like the sciences because every single area of knowledge has its own value and has its own method of knowledge construction. Okay, so in answering this question, my take on it is that the study of the past cannot be scientific because of the nature of the object of study, which is history. As I mentioned just now, we cannot access the past, and there are lots of other methods that we can use to study history that are arguably more meaningful than just doing inductive reasoning through experimentation, because after all, you cannot actually experiment the past. And the second reason why I think the study of history cannot be scientific is because of the nature of knowledge that historians seek to construct about the past. So this is once again circling back to the idea that history is interpretivist. So here's how I would go about outlining my argument and presenting it. So some philosophers hold the view that the study of the past can be scientific. So a scientific study of the past is defined as the study of the past by employing steps in the Baconian scientific method, such as observation, hypothesis, experimentation, results analysis, and theory generation, where the knowledge obtained is about a mind-independent external reality that is directly accessible to the inquirer. In asking the question, how far can the study of the past be scientific, the question makes an assumption that the study of the past can be scientific and should be scientific. Because when they ask you, how far can the study of the past be scientific, it's implying that the study of the past can be scientific, and because we're asking about the extent to which the study of the past can be scientific, we might be casting actually a value judgment to say that, hey, we should evaluate the extent to which history can be studied scientifically because maybe it should be studied scientifically after all. However, as E.H. Carr once mentioned, history is an unending dialogue between the past and the present. Hence, I argue that the study of the past cannot be scientific due to the nature of the object of study in history and the nature of knowledge historians seek to construct about the past. Thus, rather than adopting a positivist approach in the study of history, I argue that history takes on an interpretivist approach. Nevertheless, while the methodology of history is not scientific, history is still grounded in objective facts of the past through reference to historical sources. So definitely, history doesn't really use scientific methods like the Baconian scientific method as outlined previously, but history is still actually grounded in objective facts of the past because historians must have a basis upon which they make their historical inferences, and it's not entirely baseless. In asking how far can the study of the past be scientific, the question assumes that the study of the past can be scientific such that the extent of history aligning to the scientific method can be measured. Some logical positivists, such as Leopold von Ranke, concur with this view and claim that history can be studied through adopting the scientific method to construct historical knowledge. However, historical knowledge gleaned from using the scientific method is meaningless in our expansion of our body of historical knowledge. This is because only historical knowledge, such as descriptions of historical events, are attained if we were to adopt the view recommended by Ranke. By observing, hypothesizing, experimenting, and generating theory, we only obtain historical knowledge at face value. Descriptions of events such as World War II began in 1942 is unhelpful in our understanding of the causes, implications, and costs of the historical event. Hence, the scientific method cannot be used to study history. Additionally, the scientific method cannot be used to study history because of the nature of the object of study in history. Unlike the natural sciences, where there is an accessible external mind-independent reality that we can correspond our scientific knowledge to, such that experimentation can occur, history is the study of the past which is directly inaccessible to historians. This view is espoused by deconstructivists such as Alan Manslow. Hence, the scientific method cannot be employed because there is no mind-independent reality with which historical claims can correspond to. Furthermore, some types of historical claims are less easily accessible than others. Historical knowledge of the Sea Peoples and the city of Atlantis are elusive to historians due to the limited amount of historical sources available of these now vanished communities. Hence, unlike science where most scientific phenomena are easily accessible from the natural world, such as observations of microbes through a microscope, historical claims fall within a spectrum, where some claims are more easily accessible than others. This highlights another fundamental difference between history and science, such that history cannot be studied scientifically through the scientific method. Lastly, the nature of history is such that history could be shaped by political agenda that the scientific method does not take into account in any of its steps in the scientific method. Hence, history cannot be studied scientifically. Echoing Foucault, who posits that history and historical narratives are shaped by people in political power, this is especially evident in how Sima Qian was a prominent historian during the Han Dynasty, but his recording of history was likely to be slanted to favor the interests of the Qing government, as he was imprisoned under the Qing government at the time and would likely want to paint the Qing government in a good light. Clearly, the Baconian scientific method does not account for the influence of politics and power in the construction of historical knowledge, and hence is unsuitable to be applied to the study of history due to the fundamental differences in the nature of historical and scientific knowledge. Alright, so that's the end of argument 2. So now we'll be moving on to argument 3, which is the type of knowledge that history seeks to construct. So, let's go. I also argue that the study of the past cannot be scientific due to the type of knowledge history seeks to construct. While the scientific method endeavors to produce descriptions of natural phenomena, as well as generalizations about natural phenomena, history seeks to construct interpretations of the past and not generalizations. The interpretivist approach of history cannot be attained through the scientific method, and descriptions of the past are meaningless in an interpretivist approach. Hence, the study of the past cannot be scientific. In order to construct these interpretations, Collingwood suggests historians can apply reenactment, where they place themselves in the shoes of historical agents to understand a historical event from their perspective. Following that, Collingwood proposes colligation through identifying dominant concepts to illuminate the facts and construct explanations. These explanations can be further narrativized into a historical narrative through methods of employment put forth by deconstructivist Hayden White in order to construct historical interpretations and historical knowledge. As only undergoing reenactment by putting ourselves in the shoes of great men in history face the possibility of historians constructing a dominant meta-narrative which leads to a one-sided perspective of the historical event, Lyotard recommends a deviation from dominant meta-narratives in postmodern history, through the incorporation of little stories of a historical event from marginalized communities involved in the historical event in order to obtain a synoptic view of the historical event. This strengthens and expands the historical knowledge constructed. For instance, in the construction of historical knowledge of the Chernobyl disaster, multiple perspectives are obtained through the collection of oral history accounts of villagers living in Chernobyl and that of first responders to the disaster, painting a more holistic picture of the disaster that adds to historical knowledge. Evidently, history strives to construct interpretations of the past, and the goal of history remains to attain the most comprehensive perspective of every historical event, which the scientific method cannot help to attain due to its goal of producing descriptions rather than the interpretations that history aims for. Hence, while the study of the past cannot be scientific, I have proven that there are other more suitable methods of historical knowledge construction, such as those proposed by Collingwood, Hayden White, and Lyotard. Before we continue in the next line of argument, let me show you this line of reasoning. So in argument 3, I have talked about how the type of knowledge that history seeks to construct is very different from that of the sciences. So we cannot really use the scientific method to construct history, because to construct historical knowledge, because they are fundamentally different. And even so, okay fine, even if the scientific method can construct historical knowledge for whatever reasons, but the area of historical knowledge has its own unique methods. And why must we superimpose, per se, why must we quote unquote superimpose the scientific method on studying history or constructing historical knowledge, when there are already existing methods to study history, which are already tried and tested, in the sense that they are quite reasonable ways to get around some limitations of historical knowledge and capitalize on historical knowledge strength, like the historical sources strength, in order to provide a much more well-rounded view of history. So firstly, I would mention Collingwood, his reenactment and his colligation, in order for historians to put themselves in the shoes of the historical agent and really understand what the historical agent went through. You need reenactment, you need colligation, and perhaps after really putting ourselves in the shoes of historical agents, we'll be able to craft a more logical narrative about what exactly happened in history. So that was proposed by Hayden White in the narrativization of history, in order to make history more palatable to academics, to people who are learning history. For example, if you see the history of Singapore, there's this legend of Sang Nila Utama, and that's really a narrative of history that makes it more relatable, makes it more impressionable. So it just makes history more approachable in that sense. And then after we mentioned Hayden White, we did mention Lyotard to say that the danger and the threat of having history as a narrative is that there is a dominant narrative, there might be some voices that are overshadowed. And because these voices are overshadowed, Lyotard proposed that we need to look into the little stories, the micro-narratives, that allow us to have a more comprehensive view of historical events and obtain a synoptic view of whatever event it is, in order to really listen to various perspectives, just like how Collingwood championed the empathy that's needed in history to really construct historical knowledge that is valuable both in the present and also bringing forth into the future. So historical knowledge construction methods might be more suited to history and the study of history than that of the sciences. And now we're going to move on to argument 4 and argument 5. Because of the interpretivist approach of studying history, history also seeks to study the historical inquirer, which cannot be achieved through adopting the scientific method, as the scientific method places a less heavy emphasis on studying the inquirer. E.H. Carr claims that in history, one must study the historian before studying the facts. This is due to the greater influence historians play in constructing historical knowledge. A historiography of the depiction of the role of Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, in the Chinese Cultural Revolution is evidence of the variation of interpretations historians can have over one singular historical event or historical agent. While Australian historian Ross Terrell alludes to Jiang Qing as a white-bone demon, vilifying her role in the revolution, feminist historians paint her as a role model in female leadership that should be learned from. Thus, studying the historian is crucial to understand the perspectives of historians and their biases in order to inform our knowledge of the merits and limitations of historical knowledge constructed by each historian. This is to attain a more comprehensive perspective of historical events, such as the role of Jiang Qing in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. While the study of the past cannot be scientific, historical knowledge is still grounded in objective facts by reference to the historical source material. So that's our argument 5. The position put forth by Hayden White may be too extreme in claiming that all history is subjective and merely a narrative constructed by historians, using modes of employment like comedy and tragedy to convey historical knowledge across. Hence, I argue that history fundamentally still seeks to ground historical interpretations in historical facts. Echoing Koselleck, who champions for the veto power of the sources, where there are multiple contradictory perspectives of a historical event, historians should use historical sources as a power of veto to eliminate unreliable representations of the past. This can be done in tandem with Haid's institutional disconfirmation, which suggests historians engage in debate about various historical narratives to attain a consensus. While a consensus may be challenging to attain in an interpretivist area of knowledge such as history, as evidenced by the traditionalist, revisionist, and post-revisionist historiographies of who caused the World War, the presence of historical sources and a community of historians still arguably ground the study of history in objective facts, despite the study of the past not being scientific. Alright, so over here I've written down Koselleck and Head's institutional disconfirmation already. So now, how far can the study of the past be scientific? Rather than think the study of the past can be scientific, it is just a matter of how scientific, as implied by the question's phrasing of how far. I argue that the study of history cannot be scientific at all, due to the nature of the object of study in history and the type of historical knowledge historians seek to construct. As such, rather than conform to the scientific method which this essay defines scientific to be, I argue that history should employ its own unique interpretivist methods, which are nevertheless grounded in objective facts of the past attained through historical sources. And the methods employed to study the natural world cannot be employed to study the past, and that is all right. Nobody said that we needed to employ the scientific methods to study history. Perhaps rather than adopt an outlook similar to that of scientism, where scientific methods are superior and other areas of knowledge should aim to emulate the scientific method, it is more apt to recognize the merits of the unique methods of inquiry based on the differing nature of knowledge amongst areas of knowledge and employ these methods to construct knowledge in that area. Alright, that's the end of today's Philosophy with Xing. Hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you and goodbye. See you at our next episode.